Hi, David Vizard here, and you are watching PowerTech 10. In this episode, which will be episode 90, we're going to look at something which certainly starts off a lot different to what you're used to seeing in a tech feature. So here we go. Now I'm going to show you a very unlikely source of horsepower. This will take you by surprise. Here it is. Now, I know those of you who are a little older than average will probably think this has got something to do with the fact that beans cause gas. And the gas produced is mostly methane. And this will be especially relevant to those of you who have watched Blazing Saddles. If you haven't watched Blazing Saddles, do so, but be aware you will need splints for your ribs after, because it is the most hilarious movie you'll come across in a long time. Anyway, on with the plot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how this can result in power. Are you still wondering? Well, it's quite simple. Beans produce methane. Is methane a good fuel? Well, sure it is. You can use it as a combustion enhancer. Instead of having that vaporized fuel and turning gasoline. Andy, couldn't you have picked a better frame to freeze? I look like some kind of dork in this one, but folks, here's what Andy's meaning. Somewhere I should have said at this point, although I'll deal with it in more detail, that to get efficient combustion, it seems like you need to have about 15% of the fuel vaporized. But more on that later. So let's go back to a moving picture. Here we go. Into a gas, methane is already a gas and it can substitute for that 15% you may not have. However, here's the crunch. That's got nothing to do with what we're going to do. The fact that can is full of beans is totally irrelevant. It's the can we're interested in, not the beans. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a cool can. This is used to cool down the fuel going to the carburetor. But I need to define working, because most people would think, well, if it works, we're going to go faster. No. Now let me tell you a little story. And the point of this story is temperature management of the intake charge. Why would we cool the fuel? Because we can cool down the fuel a lot easier than trying to cool down the air. And since we're putting 1/13 of the weight of fuel in that we have air, but the fuel has a higher specific heat, it can dispense with a lot more heat than you might at first suspect. Now, does this work? Yes, but that doesn't mean you go faster. Now, let me tell you this story, which I started on just now. When I was doing a lecture at Charlotte University back in about 1999. Yes, that'd be about 1999. Coatings to cool down intakes and that had been around a while, but no one was raving about them. And the subject came around to coatings, and I explained what they did, and I showed the results of coating the intake manifold, just the intake manifold, with a coating produced by, I'll have to put it up here because I can't bring it to mind at the moment. And it picked up 11, the result was 11 horsepower increase. Now, many of my audience were cup car guys. In fact, virtually the front row in the auditorium were either Hendrix Motorsport guys or DEI. I asked all these guys, how many of you have tried coatings? Well, surprisingly or not, must be close to half of the audience put their hands up. And then I said, okay, without looking around to see who else does so, put your hands up, those who've seen more power on the dyno. Only one guy put his hand up. Okay, sit down, that's all I needed to know. Now then, how many of you measured the temperature drop between the carburetor and the intake valve, or the carburetor and the cylinder head, right? And about 8 or 9 people put their hands up. And I said, now, was it about 50 to 75 degrees? And there, I said, just keep your hand up if it is. Yep, that's what they saw. But you say it doesn't work because you didn't see any more horsepower. Yeah, and there's a few head noddings going on. So there, I sat them all down. I said, contrary to what you think, it is working. It's working exactly as you intended. It's cooling down the charge. The fact of the matter is that you didn't do your job, and that is take advantage of this cooler charge. Now, the cool can, or cooling the fuel, isn't going to do everything for you. It's just going to cool the fuel. You have to now give that engine what it wants in terms of mixture quality to make use of that colder charge. Let me explain. What we've got going on here is the colder charge has less amount of the fuel vaporized. Now, my measurements, and they are rough measurements, has indicated that unless you have about 15% of the fuel at the valve vaporized, you are not going to get good combustion unless all of the fuel droplets are smaller than 5 microns. That's difficult to do. Some will be, but most of them won't. Now then, here's what we have to do. When we drop the charge temperature by that much, a whole bunch of the front ends on the blends of the fuels we're using don't evaporate. So what you gain on volumetric efficiency and a denser charge, you lose on having worse combustion efficiency. That is, it doesn't light off as easily and it doesn't burn as completely during the power stroke. Right? So, let me tell you about some experiments I did with David Braswell. What David did was supply me with a carburetor, and I believe it was a 750 modified by him, right? It had a 850 base plate, but 750 barrels, but everything was airflowed in. So the bottom line here was that it was about an 830 carburetor as far as airflow was concerned, but as far as booster signal was concerned and drivability, it drove more like, well no, it drove better than a 750, right? So the idea was that we would grab both ends of the RPM range here. Now I tested this on a 350 Chevy, and here's what happened. When we started off with a dogleg booster, which has a very poor signal to airflow ratio, right? It works when you have an intake manifold that is exhaust heated. If you don't have an exhaust heated intake manifold, you have a carburetor that is less effective than it could be. Before going any further, it occurs to me that it would be a good idea if I covered the various booster designs that are available for a Holley carburetor. So here they are. Let's take them one at a time. Number 1 is the straight leg booster. It originates from way back when Holley first started making 4150 style carburetors for OEM installations back in the 50s. It works only if there's a lot of manifold heat applied, because its atomization capabilities are very poor. The bottom line here is that in most instances it has no place on a race engine or a high-performance engine. Moving on to booster number 2, we find we have on our hands here a good all-rounder. The booster signal with this dogleg booster is far and away above what the signal given by the straight leg booster is. At the end of going through this, I'll show you a graph of the different booster signal strengths. Anyway, like I said, this is a good all-rounder. It does a much better job. It works pretty good on both unheated and heated intake manifolds, but it's not the last thing in dogleg boosters. For that, we have to go to number 3. Booster number 3 is known as a stepped dogleg. The reason for this is that it is essentially booster number 2 with a step machined in below the minor diameter of the booster venturi. Surprisingly, this step gives very little in the way of extra booster signal, but it does break up the fuel much better. As such, it's probably in 99% of cases, the ideal booster for a 4150 carburetor on a totally unheated manifold. Moving on to boosters 4 and 5. What we have here is typical of the forms often seen when an annular discharge booster is used. Holley make their own design, and there are aftermarket companies that also modify the Holley booster. The two most popular forms are, as per number 4, where there is a step right before the discharge holes, and number 5, it's just a plain venturi. Looking at the booster signals given by all of the boosters, you'll see how they stack up in terms of signal strength. Well, here they are, boosters 1 through 5. 1, the black curve, is our straight leg booster. Fairly indifferent in terms of performance, signal's not great, and it doesn't atomize that well. Surprisingly enough, boosters 2 and 3 are only marginally better in terms of signal, but they atomize the fuel much better, especially number 3. Boosters 4 and 5 are the annular discharge boosters. Now you can see they are significantly better in terms of signal, over double that of the stock booster. So this is very good when you have a lot of fuel to deal with, such as E85 or methanol. Now, I've heard say by some people that they don't like the annular discharge booster because it blocks the venturi. Well, two things. One, it doesn't actually block the venturi, it just looks like it. And 2, it's irrelevant whether they like it or not, it's whether the engine likes it. If you are running a very cold fuel and it's a lot of fuel because it's not a gasoline mix, these are well worth investigating. From experience, I can tell you there's up to 30 horsepower to be gained on your typical high compression 350 when using alcohol-based fuels. The first tests I'm going to present here are those that I did with the Braswell carburetor. This first test was done with a non-thermally controlled Victor Junior intake manifold. When we used the stock straight leg booster in the carburetor and then checked that against a thermally insulated manifold, we lost 7 horsepower. The next tests were both boosters in a thermally insulated intake manifold. First, the straight leg booster in the thermally insulated manifold. It lost 5 horsepower compared to the same booster in a non-thermally barriered intake manifold. So this proves that just because you cool the charge does not mean you get more horsepower. Again, it's a question of the barrier was doing its job. It was cooling the charge. However, the booster was not taking advantage of that. In fact, it is so bad at atomizing fuel that it needed heat to work. That's a Band-Aid fix. Now, that same intake manifold with the Braswell booster in there, in the carburetor, produced an 11 horsepower increase. Produced an 11 horsepower increase. So we can say that the thermal barriers work. You've just got to make sure that you give them what they want to work. Okay, now on to the next subject. So, I've been talking about cooled cans. How do we make one from a can of beans? Well, the first thing is we have to empty the beans, right? Don't do that all at once, it has consequences. Right, so what you do is you very carefully take the lid off, and then using copper tube of adequate diameter, and if you've got a high output engine, you may have to use 2 copper tubes so that you can get the flow through. But typically you're going to want a tube around about 3/16 to 1/4 inch diameter, and like I said, that may be 1 or 2. Now, what you need to do now is to be able to bend them up so that they are spiraled in the can. And to do that best, fill them with fine sand and crimp off the ends. Now remember, you're going to need something that's pretty long. You'll have to work that out, how long it's got to be. Then once you've filled them with sands, bend the ends over so that the sand now holds the tube cross-sectional area in a circle instead of it flattening out as you bend it. Now wind it in a close loop. Leave a gap between each loop, but you can wind it round something like a baseball bat or something like that. And then bend them up, the middle one up so that it comes almost to the top, and feed it out through the side. Then feed the other one out through the side. One will be an inlet, one will be an outlet. It's good to have them on opposite sides. Now you have to make up a fitting to go on either end, and then what you do now is you run your fuel through that, and in the can you will put either water and ice, antifreeze water and ice, or antifreeze water and dry ice, right? The dry ice one works best. It'll really bring the fuel temperature down. Of course, the cooler you make the fuel, the more you're going to have to focus on that atomization. Be warned. Now, if you don't want to do that and you want something fancy, I've got the solution. What I've used in the past is the Moroso cool can, right? And this is a really nice piece. Here's photographs of it and you can see what's inside. Section 1's coming up. So let's take a look at some tests that I did up at Terry's, where we had a carburetor where we could artificially change both the boosters in the carburetor screw in the top, and we could control the fuel temperature. And what I did there was I made up a system, and I think I've got a photograph of it here somewhere, whereby we fed a certain amount of the fuel through a dry ice cool can, right? And the fuel was coming out at about minus 35 degrees, right? So it was really cold. Freeze water into solid rock, hard ice. And we would then feed that into the float bowl, which we had temperature sensors, which then went back to a valve which regulated the amount of fuel which went through the ice so that it hit our control temperature. And it would do that very stably. There was an overflow. So if the fuel got too hot or too cold, it would overflow, and regulated fuel would come in and replace it very quickly. So it would follow what we wanted very concisely. we could hold fuel temperature in a carburetor which normally go hot to within about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So we could set the temperature and hold it there. Now, what I'm going to show you now is the result of a dyno test where we optimized the uncooled system and it wasn't ragingly hot in the dyno cell. 75 maybe. So it represented a fairly cool summer day. And against that, I'm going to show you what we got where we optimized the booster and the fuel temperature. Now, I say optimized. I'm not sure it's possible to optimize this because there's a limit to how much you can adjust this, that, and the other. The limitation probably is the booster atomization, but that's not clear. However, under conditions that can be met at the track on a cool summer day, here are the dyno figures. What you see here are some dyno tests I ran with the late Brad Urban of the Carburetor shop in California. At first glance, the figures look kind of okay, but nothing that you'd write home about. However, we need to look at them in context. These figures were obtained on what could be best described as a cool summer's day, not one that was ragingly hot. So the gains are from a good setup under normal conditions to a much better setup under the artificial conditions created by the cool fuel. As you can see, the gain in power is made totally by an increase in torque. Basically what we're looking at here is around about an 18 foot-pound increase in torque and about 20 horsepower over the power band that you'd use going down the track. Not bad. Had this been a typical California summer's day with the temperatures around 95 to 100 degrees, those results would be about double what they are. Let's start about setting up the wrapping up session here. First, if you want to build this controllable temperature deal and sort boosters out, it's quite a long-winded deal to explain here. So the best I can do here is to recommend for those few of you who may want to build this, it's not for everyone, it's a bit complicated, but for those few, a detailed deal is in my book on super tuning Holley carburetors, directly available from Amazon. Now, you don't have to go to as complex a system as that. When David McCoy and I utilized a cool can system on our drag race Malibu, picture of the engine compartment come up in a minute, used on our drag race Malibu, what we did was, rather than have lots of switches, gauges, T-junctions, etc., we had a small electric pump. It doesn't have to be very much at all, you know, like 10 gallons an hour, probably be about the minimum you want, but that's not a problem. And we got some of the float bowls from the Holley HP carburetors that have the drain in the middle at the bottom of the float bowl. And we pumped that back to the fuel tank. Now, here's what happened. Whilst the engine was idling and at less than full throttle, this pump sucked fuel out of the float bowl and dumped it back in the tank. So, and we calibrated it with a jet so that we could set it so it was just right. So that if we let the engine idle for a couple of minutes beforehand, or in fact just switched it on, beforehand, what would happen is fuel would be sucked from the float bowl, cold fuel would come in, and it would cool the carburetor down. Now that's important, because if you don't have this pre-cooling of the carburetor, your cold fuel system does not come into play until you're halfway down the drag strip. Bit late then, it's all over. Remember, whether you win or lose, 90% of the time is dependent on how the car leaves the line. That's when you want maximum torque. That's why we did okay. When the engine goes to full throttle, it disconnects the pump. So now the carburetor is all cold, and fuel at the rate that the engine wants is coming in cold. Keeps that carburetor stone cold the entire run. Can't remember what it was worth, because I don't know that we ran many runs without it, because we knew it went faster with it. So it was on fairly early on in the game. But notice in the picture, all the fuel lines are insulated, including the pressure regulator valve. Just regular foam and tie wraps around it. Ugly, but effective. You could say, I'm only into looks as a second deal. Performance is number one every time. If it just looks good and doesn't go, that's not for me. I want it to be the fastest there first and the best looking second. Now, what else can I tell you? Oh yes, one more thing. These cool fuel systems tend to work best or the easiest when they are used on something like a restricted circle track motor. Some rules ban their use, so that might be a problem there. But the point is this: turbo motors and restricted motors respond very well to doing this. You've got to, on a turbo motor with too small an intercooler, you've got to cool that fuel down. Not necessarily to make it less detonation prone, that's another benefit, but to make sure that the fuel's front end hydrocarbons don't evaporate and constitute part of the boost. You don't want that. You want the boost to be solely the atmosphere, and ideally you need direct injection. Now if you've got a direct injected motor, this is not going to do as well for you as you might think. May increase the boost before it detonates, fine, but if it's direct injected, all the effect of the cold fuel happens in the last millisecond in the chamber. Not enough time for it to do anything. Now, what you could do to cool the fuel down, water injection, but that's another deal altogether, and we will look at that down the road. Note, you guys with 2.3 Mustangs, this could be a winner. Thank you for watching.